Welcome to the Property Couch, where each week you get to listen to two of Australia's leading property experts as they share with you the insider's guide to property investing.
All right, folks, you're on the Property Couch, your insider's guide to property investing. I'm Bryce, Holdaway, co-host of Location Australia on Foxtel's Lifestyle channel. And he's Ben Kingsley, chair of the Property Investment Professionals of Australia and the current Property Investment Advisor of the Year. How are you, mate?
Still current, but I think the new one will be announced soon. But still current. Very well, Bryce. Very well indeed.
In our eyes, mate, you're the Property Investment Advisor of the Year. But we do have some news. You had some ambition to end in the top 100.
Yes, the tipping comp
in the footy tips.
Yeah, that's the big.
Of 500,000 people, wasn't it?
Just under 500,000 people. We obviously have our own internal staff one, and Bryce was leading. I led for a couple of rounds there, about 4 or 5 rounds, but Bryce and I were on the same number but different margins. So if none of you are AFL listeners, I'll just quickly unpack it. Every Friday night game, you get to choose the margin, and then so if you're on the same number, it's the margin that separates you. So I had a chance. Collingwood and Essendon, and the other game was Melbourne and Greater Western Sydney. And so I thought, I was in the top 100 out of 500,000 people. So I thought, I'll just go with who I think will win. And what happened?
Well, mate, so your ambition was to go top 100. How'd you go?
So I didn't care about winning the local one. I've always, always think big picture. Wanted to get top 100 across Australia. And I finished 101st. Thank you very much, Collingwood, or thank you very much, Essendon. Bloody 3 points. Yes, and by a margin of 2 points.
2 points.
So I had the same number of tips, and same number of tips as you, but you obviously, I think our margin difference was, 20?
Yeah, and you'll notice that I, throughout the season, there was one Thursday night match that I forgot to put in.
Oh, right,
so
okay.
Forgot
well, what about Hawthorn? Thanks, Hawthorn against Port Adelaide. I tipped Hawthorn to win that by 60 points at Etihad Stadium, and they got shellacked.
There's your margin right there.
There was my margin. I blew out. My margin was awesome up until that point. So thanks, Hawthorn. I hope you don't get the chocolates at the end of the year. You've already had them 2 years in a row. So someone else's turn.
Freo.
Maybe Freo, Bryce's teams.
Exactly.
Okay. Anyway, we're not here to talk about footy. Let's talk about...
Well, I just want... I ended up in the top 100. Came 91st.
Yes,
so not only did I beat you at the tips, I actually got the goal that you wanted.
He's pretty competitive, this bloke.
I'm very, very competitive, which is probably not a great thing. All right, so talking about competition, we're going to talk today about a number of things, but including oversupply. Yeah. And that's a big topic that's come up around property investment of late.
Yeah, well, we've actually been talking about it, and if outside of the blog, in terms of we get approached to talk at major functions and events. If you're listening to this and you need a speaker on property investment, Bryce and myself are always available to come and talk to an audience around property investing. So what we're talking about here is, for the last few years, there's been an undersupply of residential property in the marketplace. So as the mining boom took off, we still had strong population growth, but all of the resources, the human resource, was moving away to the mining sector. And now that human resource is coming back. And this is planned by government, planned by Treasury, planned by the RBA in terms of to stimulate, because obviously we've always talked about a two-tier economy. We had the mining economy and then the actual real economy. And now that mining economy is softening, what we're basically seeing is that resource coming back, and we need to employ these people. And so when you drop the cash rate, what you get is the stimulus in the economy. And so this has been a construction-led recovery, and that's what they were planning to do. So we've now seen, interestingly, in the last 3 years, we've seen a pickup of around 40% of dwelling approvals. So it's happening. But what does that mean for the broader economy, basically, and for the property sector? It means that at some point we could hit that equilibrium. And when we hit that equilibrium, there's going to be markets that are going to be oversupplied. And I've been talking about Sydney as being a market that I'm worried about, in the sense that because it has very, very strong economy, strong jobs growth, and people moving there. And that's what people do. They move to follow the jobs. But where I am worried about is apartments. Brisbane, high density apartments close to town, extremely worried about that, as well as the stuff that's happening in the greenfields, the sort of big subdivision, and the amount of investment that's going on in that particular marketplace as investors chase yield. And Melbourne, absolute pockets of Melbourne as well. Flagstaff Gardens area, the top end of the sort of bottom end of the city. There's still going to be some oversupply in South Bank, and other parts like South Yarra and those types of markets. So, what is the message? More than ever, asset selection. You've heard us talk about this before. Asset selection is critical. So, because we can talk broadly, like what I've just done then, around the nation, but in reality, it all comes down to you picking one asset and picking it in the right location and trying to time that right.
That's right, you're buying a localised market, you're not buying Melbourne, you're not buying Sydney. The amount of times I've heard someone from each state say to me, I shouldn't be buying in Melbourne because the sentiment there is that there's too many apartments. And it's like, well, to be honest, I have bought some apartments for some clients recently, but it's nowhere near where that oversupply exists. And quite often a client or a potential client will say, well, why do they keep building them in Melbourne? And I think it's a big challenge because our manufacturing industry has been affected so much. So the government has this fine balance of letting development approvals go through because they need to employ Victorians, but at the same time providing some oversupply. So that's why having, we talk about it all the time. A client will say to me, why would I use a buyer's agent? One of the big reasons is because they'll make sure you buy the right asset. And, whilst I always say there's 4 quadrants that you can buy or take advice from when it comes to property investing. And unfortunately, in my view, I think 85% of property investors take it from the most vulnerable quadrant. Yeah. And that's where people with shiny brochures selling on, shiny taps and, brand new smelling carpet leave people vulnerable. And the fact that someone lives in a house doesn't necessarily mean they know how to buy an investment property. So they are vulnerable to that space. And so if you know not to buy that type of asset and know there's thousands and thousands of dwellings in Melbourne that you would consider, then you don't have to have any fear.
That's right. And I come back to the story of buying with your head versus buying with your heart. And if you're new to property investing, more often than not, you don't have that level of context, that level of detail that's needed to make those informed decisions. And you don't usually aggregate from the top down. So when I talk about aggregating your research, what I'm talking about is starting national and then coming down and looking at state, and then coming down and looking at city, then coming down looking at local government area, then coming down looking at suburb, then coming down and looking at local neighbourhood. They're the types of sciences and that aggregation of knowledge to know, because this is an investment, guys. We're not, doesn't have to be around the corner from you. You don't have to keep driving past it. It's, we've talked about borderless investing in the past. This is about getting a return on investment. And most people, when they're investing in property, look at yield first and then think, well, that's a good yield, I'll go and chase that. So, and that yield can be smashed through oversupply fairly quickly, especially in the apartment market. And because, unfortunately, when they go and think, I can go and see an old house or I can go and see an old unit, well, that looks a bit tired. You're not living in it. And the renter, the tenant, might be very comfortable with that. In fact, having a slightly lower rent than the bling property down the road, where that investor who's paid another $110,000 for new versus the old, that tenant sort of saying, well, that's money in my pocket, and I can then use that money to save up to eventually get into the property market myself. So for us, if the footprint's the same, we would go existing in that location and applaud those people who are buying the new in the medium density stuff, because it gives us critical mass for the lifestyle drivers in the area, but we wouldn't touch them with a barge pole.
Well, that's the challenge, isn't it? We're relying on them for the ones that we would choose to perform. I've got a client who's buying their first investment property in Melbourne. It's been a funny old space because their budget's around 600 and it's a really busy price point, as you know, with first home buyers, and they get some stamp duty concessions. And the discussion I had with them during the week is they're feeling a bit fatigued. It's actually taken a little while. And I bought my first property 16 years ago. Yours is 20 plus years ago. Yep. It's easy to forget what's going on for the investor in their head the first time that they invest in a property, because, for us, it seems so obvious the ones you'd avoid. And in talking to, a couple of the team here, when we go and buy a property, it's like, it's got the same amount of emotion to us as going and buying a loaf of bread because we've broken it down that much. But for the first time investor, or even for the second time investor, there's lots of headspace stuff going on. And, we say, why wouldn't you go through the 5 critical steps? Why wouldn't you do the, suburb? But for them, just the sheer idea of breaking some conditioning, or their mates think they're mad, and haven't you heard, just the emotional stuff that they're going through just to buy clogs up their mind so much that they just go, well, look, I just want to get something done. If someone can take the pain away and say, well, you can give me a nice shiny brochure and you can make it easy for me, why wouldn't I? And that's why they're so vulnerable in that first investment. But ultimately, there are parts of the market that are oversupplied. But if you know what you're looking for, you're never, ever going to be vulnerable to that type of product.
So in recapping this point, what are the things you as the listener need to understand? The first thing you need to understand is if a marketplace has, like what we talked about with Sydney in earlier podcasts, if you've got 55% to 60% of the market who are buying are investors, then that is a worry, because effectively what we're seeing is when the long-term numbers are around 30%, you want to be careful that you're not buying into a market where the frenzy is happening. You should have bought in that market, 12 months ago. So that's the science of timing the market right. And then secondly, you need to make sure that there's, from the supply side, that you're not going to see an oversupply come into that market where you're going to have to drop your rents. And look, there's going to be times where in any market you'll have times where tenants are lean, but that's the nature of the long. As I said, I've been doing this for 21 years now. I bought that property when I was 23 in Melbourne, and the reality is that sometimes properties are going to be, people are going to move on, relationships are going to break down, or they're going to save up and eventually get into the marketplace themselves, and you look for that next one. So take the long-term view, but just understand that don't, be careful of the new stock that can come on, because they can turn that tap on really quickly, and make sure that you do your numbers right.
I'd also be conscious of the cost, because you've got historically low interest rates and people aren't pressure testing their budget at higher amounts. And I think that's, when you've got interest rates so low, you've got an environment where everyone's saying investment is great. I think people should be conscious of the fact that, I still remember growing up with my father paying off a mortgage during the recession we had to have, where interest rates were at a higher level, 17, 18%. Now, we're a long way away from that right now. But ultimately, people just think in an environment of interest rates being low for some time, it'll never change. And I've seen that happen before when people fall into a false sense of security around that. So ultimately, it's about making sure that the decisions that you're making now will serve you for the medium and the long term, just not the short term. Yeah. So if you get the asset selection right, you get the borrowing power right, you get the cash flow management right, and you put some defence in place. Wait a minute,
that sounds like something we've talked about before.
Imagine that, you'd actually get it right. But I mean, the thing is that none of property investing is any secrets. It's, we reinforce old points, the 4 pillars, the 5 critical steps, the fundamentals that come from choosing established over new. We constantly refer back to these over numerous podcasts, but it's amazing how many people actually forget those fundamentals. I was talking to someone during the week who'd been encouraged by I've gone on record as a spruiker, a salesperson masquerading as an advisor, suggesting that someone should buy 2 house and land packages in the outer skirts of one of the popular CBDs at the moment. And after chatting with me, I'd encouraged him to maybe cool the jets on that idea, come to us and talk about cash flow, how it's going to affect their bottom line first, and then we'll decide what the asset selection was. But as soon as I thought I'd had them reassured, they ring me the next day and go, I've been looking, I found this one, what do you think? And again, it was just this almost addiction, like almost gambling or alcohol addiction, like to just spend the money that was in their pocket just because they had it, rather than saying, well, just cool the jets for a bit. We've got to make a good decision here.
I was on holidays recently, and I had, a client ring up and say, oh, look, I found something. I'm just really sorry to interrupt you on your holiday. And I'm like, but
I've been noticing on the streets.
Donna, let's settle down. And it was, 48 in the apartment block. The brother was saying, look, I think it's a good deal. I've got one in there, like, oh my God. And I had to explain it. I said, so when was it last sold? Oh, 2011. Oh, and how much is it worth now? The same price. So it's a good buy. What the developer's offloading some of the stock that he kept. I'm like, Donna, doesn't that give you some concern? The market in Melbourne is moving really well, and the value of this asset has not improved over 4 and a bit years. Like, yeah. So call your jets. But I suppose,
Can I just say on that point, because it's a very good one. I think a lot of people get caught up on price and how much it's going to cost them. And if they can find an asset that's not going to cost them much, they feel the security around that versus its performance.
Yeah.
Because, ultimately, it just makes sense to use a buyer's agent. I know this sounds self-serving, but I recently talked to someone who bought a property for $275,000 in 2005. And now in 2015, that's one cycle, it's 7%.
Yeah.
So it typically should be worth $550,000. And the conversation I had with that person at the beginning was, how's the asset performing? It's great, really great. It's looking after itself. It's neutral. I said, okay, so how's the capital growth gone? Well, actually, that's the thing. It hasn't gone as well as I hoped it would. And I said, well, so how much is it worth? He goes, 400. So you've left $150,000 on the table because of two things. You're price sensitive of how much it's going to cost you out of your pocket each week, and you're price sensitive of not getting a professional to help you make a better decision.
Yeah.
So it's almost like that person who's bought that property, they're price sensitive of what it's going to cost them, but almost blind to the fact that it hasn't performed.
So true, Bryce. I think we do talk about cash flow management and what's affordable to you, and absolutely you must take a long-term view of holding this asset. So there's nothing more frustrating and more wealth draining than people who buy and then have to get out in 3 or 4 years because it's outside their budget parameters. Now, that being said, if the thing that you're being sold on by anyone who's trying to convince you of an investment grade asset is that it's not going to cost you much to own, that's not good enough. What needs to be said is, here are the growth drivers. These are the reasons why. This is the demographic change that are happening. This is the profile of the people who live in there. This is their age profile. This is their education profile. So all of a sudden, and this is their convenience to the major employment centres. These are the types of things that, and here are the lifestyle amenity that's going to attract people to want to be in this location longer term. They're all growth drivers that drive owner-occupied people into an area they feel safe and comfortable in, and they can raise a family, and they buy emotionally, and that's what pushes prices higher. If you're bringing them into an area where it's all investors, good luck with that. And that's, some parts of Brizzy, like the Loganshire and that type of thing. I just feel like everyone keeps talking about it. And I'd love to know the numbers of investors that are buying in there, because I would think, it worries me to a sense that if it's good value and the yields are still around 5%, if there's more and more investors that go into that marketplace, but yet the profile and the desire of living in those suburbs is still a low status and no drivers, well, who's going to come in and bump it all up? The only way it's going to get growth is low interest rates. And when those interest rates go higher, as you were saying, I really enjoyed the fact that I got a reasonable yield and it didn't cost me anything to hold. Well, yep, good, but what was the growth you got? What was is this property that you're buying for $350,000 going to be worth $600,000, $700,000 in 10, 15 years? Probably not if the people can't afford it. So that's the reality. That's the opportunity cost of understanding the science that is property investing.
Capital growth is what you get out of the market. Rent is what keeps you in the market. I don't think anyone can forget that. We talked
about that again, Bryce.
We've talked about that a couple of times in pre-gold, but it's really what it's about. Capital growth is the reason that you're investing, in our view, and there are variations to that, let's be honest, but all things being equal, capital growth is the reason that you want to be investing, and rent is what keeps you in the market. What's that Warren Buffett saying, when the tide goes out, you see who's been swimming naked? The tide going out is if interest rates go up.
Yep.
And I remember living on the Gold Coast during the GFC.
Yep.
And so that market got slaughtered. And I remember seeing lots of for sale signs out the front and sometimes 2 or 3 in one development, which means that you are
sometimes 7.
A position of
I've taken
weakness
photos.
defined.
I've taken photos of those buildings where there's 7 out the front. You're like, oh God.
So the buyer's got the strength. So the cashed up buyer in that position who's being opportunistic is going to slaughter the person who's selling. But I remember the A-grade properties weren't up for sale. So that's important, because some of these areas, you can speculate on some area, but I think the safety of a capital city job market is, for me personally, is always something that I like for my growth properties. If I'm getting yield properties, you need to move that out a bit. But Warren Buffett's successful for a reason. So when the tide goes out, we will see who's been swimming naked, and that really comes back to a couple of things, and that's making sure we get the asset right, but also getting our lending right. And there's been some talk of late around interest only versus P&I. Got some views on that?
Yeah, look, there's growing concern from ASIC around the number of households that are doing interest only borrowings, and generally speaking, the market should be concerned about households that don't pay down debt, because if they're not paying down debt, then where is their wealth going to be? How are they going to be able to survive post their working careers and so forth? So there is an argument to say that owner-occupiers shouldn't be paying interest only. Now, in our business, we do encourage people to control the liquidity in their household. So we educate, we train households in managing their money better and using offset accounts, lines of credit, whatever it may be, to be in control of that liquidity as opposed to the bank being in control of that liquidity. So there are horses for courses. But I'm sort of putting my Pippa hat on now, and I heard John Simon the other day on Ross Greenwood's show, and he was saying, he's concerned about it as well. And in the UK, they're now sort of making P&I loans the only way, unless you see a financial advisor who can give you authority to do an interest-only loan. Now, my view is don't do that. But what you need to do is make sure the banks are assessing lending on a P&I level. So if the assessment rate is weighted higher, so there's a bit of compression margin in there's a bit of a fat in terms of how they do the assessment rate. And the assessment rate is basically how they work out how much borrowing power you've got. We'll make sure that's a P&I figure, not a interest-only figure. So then you wouldn't have that problem. And then people like us who want to be sophisticated investors who have interest-only borrowings, let us do our thing. I mean, we should be patted on the back from a wealth creation point of view, because we are trying to be less of a burden on the government purse strings when we get older. And I just get, as you can see, I get a bit angry.
You just stood up.
I get a bit
stepping in the back.
Get a bit angry around that. Government regulate to the lowest common denominator, which means that they try and put a blanket regulation or decision in play that stops people like us who are sophisticated, know what we're doing to create wealth. And, so I don't think that encourages people to learn. If you just keep putting regulation in place that protects the lowest educated people, because yes, they are vulnerable, but my argument is, teach them, educate them. Don't just put regulation in that protects them. Because how are we going to learn? How are you going to break that cycle? How are you going to be a better wealth creator if all you've got is these limiting parameters around bubble asset bubbles and those sort of things? It just doesn't make sense to me. So I'm quite passionate about this particular point. We should have the flexibility. The market should be an open market. There should not be any market intervention when it comes to interest only versus P&I. So that's the one point. The other point, I was talking to one of our clients yesterday, Jenny, who listens to the podcast. So g'day, Jenny. Thanks for listening. And I said, what else do you want to talk about? And she said, we were presenting the plan, the strategy that we built her, and she was really excited about it. But she was sort of saying, look, she's a single lady, so she's worried about borrowing power. And obviously APRA has come in and made some changes around borrowing power. And if you get on some of the forums and that type of thing, there's a lot of conversation around that. And interestingly, in our mortgage broking business, that's been the feedback from our senior advisors, who are saying we're using different lenders now. So there is a resource and there are alternate ways in which we can source those funds. And again, as long as it fits within your cash flows and your affordability, and you do your testing in terms of today and tomorrow, but it shouldn't stop that investor from doing it. So I suppose the tip there is, if you don't know, or your bank that you're working with isn't doing it, go and see a quality mortgage broker who specialises in property investment.
Yeah, I was just about to say that because we've done a podcast on who's your personal banker, but here's a classic example because we were having that chat with our team here, and they were talking about the fact that they are using second-tier lenders at the moment because the four pillars provide, they're under pressure from APRA to keep their loan book growth to investors under 10%. So therefore, they're getting better options. So if you do have a personal banker that is in with one of the four pillars, you may be seeing an opportunity cost of being able to get other opportunities or other options available for you for lending. So we certainly encourage you to have an investment savvy mortgage broker on your team, not just a mortgage broker, but an investment savvy who understands strategy as well as pricing, because that's critical.
Yeah, and they'll go out and they'll look at these second-tier lenders and potentially some peer-to-peer lenders to try and find some opportunities for you to see if you can, continue on your journey. But again, make sure you stress test it. In all of our strategies, how we stress test things, 7.25 long-term interest rates. So that's how we've been doing it. There might be an argument that we bring that down to around 6.5. At the bare minimum, 6.5% long term is what you should be looking at. So, a little tip there if you're doing your own modelling, your own forecasting in terms of whether you can afford it, use 6.5 as a minimum in regards to stress testing your ability to be able to repay that property down over time.
Quick one for the beginner listeners, beginner investors here.
Yep.
Can you do a 25 words or less what the assessment rate actually is for them?
Yep. So the assessment rate is the rate in which the debt servicing ratio that the banks use. So what that means is if the retail rate is right now it's a historical low, so call it 4.5%. The assessment rate that the banks use is a buffer. And in most cases, it's 6.5%, 7% at the moment, which is where it should be. And that is what they calibrate or work out what you can afford to borrow. Okay. In pre-APRA interference, some lenders had a policy where they would assess existing debt at its current rate and new debt at this assessment rate. But now APRA said, look, from a sustainability point of view and from PIPA's point of view, we're comfortable with that. But what we're not comfortable with is some lenders who are saying not going to take rent into consideration. So there's still potentially opportunity to get those funds, but make sure you can afford it today and tomorrow.
There you go, folks. A few things for you to chew over today in terms of oversupply, some of the changes to the environment in lending. Also a shout out to our listeners. If anyone's really passionate about property investment and they live in Melbourne, we're looking to get another person on our team who helps build property investment plans. So if you're interested, if you think that's for you and you feel like there's what sort of things are we looking for, Ben, in terms of the background?
Well, look, certainly property passion. If you've got a thing for numbers and spreadsheets, so, you're a frustrated financial planner, frustrated accountant, frustrated mortgage broker, they're the types of people that we'd be interested to hear from. We will, QPIA's out there, so qualified property investment advisors who have done some formal qualification. All of our property investment advisors undertake that course. So if you don't have that, that's not a big thing. But in terms of having a passion to help others and love crunching the numbers, we'd love to hear from them.
There you go, folks. So we thought it'd be a good shout out to our listeners because we know that you're clearly passionate about property investment. And if you do feel like you'd like to learn from someone like Ben who would mentor you into how to build strategies on behalf of other people, can you please send an email to...
Yeah, I think we'll probably send it to the Empower Wealth address. It's just probably easier. So inquiries@empowerwealth.com.au. That's our business address, inquiries@empowerwealth.com.au.
There you go, folks. If that's you, we would love to hear from you. Now, in terms of the Property Couch, we always encourage you to go to thepropertycouch.com.au, leave some reviews, leave us some feedback. We're starting to... We did a few Q&As recently, Ben, and we got through quite a few of the backlog. So we're now encouraging our listeners to send us some more queries because we will hit those in a nice little chunk like we did last time. So that's real life, on-the-ground investing queries that people have. Just a quick tip on that. We are not licensed to give advice over this podcast. So if it gets really specific in terms of your questions, we might have to sort of dance around the outside, but we'd certainly love to hear a couple of things, what your queries are or what you'd love for us to talk about on this podcast. So feel free to send that over to us. You can also go to our social media, Facebook, Twitter, Instagram. IPS is always putting up first on those locations when a new episode is actually out. So,
and I think we'll get into some strategy stuff coming. We'll dig a little deeper into some property strategy stuff in the coming podcast. What do you reckon?
I agree.
Sounds good.
I agree. All right, folks. Well, again, we've come to that bit where our credibility dives just a little bit. But Ben,
mate, this is my big moment.
This is your big moment.
Put the spotlight on me.
Can you remember the sign-offs from the last 6 weeks?
Yeah, right. Just replay them from the podcast for me, will you? What's this one? So I think we're in Romanian, and this is La Vedere. La Vedere.
Is it fair to say that Ivis, most of Ben's sign-offs have that French twang to them?
Yeah, I know.
No matter where he is.
I think maybe in my previous life I was French or Italian. I don't know what that's about. But.
Well, there you go, folks. If you're Romanian, La Vedere. For the rest of you, we will... Stay tuned next week for this intriguing round-the-world sign-off from Ben Kingsley. All right, folks. Thanks for joining us on the Property Couch. We will see you next week.